On April 26, 2002, 23-year-old Stephanie Bennett parked her car outside of her apartment complex in Raleigh, North Carolina. Stephanie was worn out from a long week at work, and so she was looking forward to relaxing and spending time with her friends over this weekend. She grabbed her purse off the passenger seat, got out of her car, and began walking towards her apartment. Stephanie was dressed in business casual work clothes. She had shoulder-length brown hair, brown eyes, and a huge smile. Stephanie's friends said she looked like she could play the perfect girl next door on a TV show. It was a beautiful spring evening in Raleigh, about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and Stephanie saw a bunch of people out by the lake that was only about 100 yards from her apartment building. Stephanie just continued walking towards the lake, and as she did, she saw all these people out having fun and walking around and jogging with their dogs. Most of the people were Stephanie's neighbors, or they lived in the apartments just on the other side of the woods that were next to her apartment complex. And while Stephanie loved seeing all the familiar faces out there by the lake, who she really liked seeing were all the dogs. And that evening, Stephanie saw a dog she thought looked particularly happy. A big black and brown Rottweiler trotting in front of its owner with its tongue hanging out of its mouth. Stephanie smiled wide and walked over to the owner and the dog, and she leaned down and said hello to the dog. Then after that, she said hello to a couple of her neighbors who were nearby, and then finally she just turned and headed towards her first floor apartment. Stephanie stepped inside and found her two roommates waiting for her on the couch. The three women had been friends for years, and they still spent as much time together as they could, even though their lives had gotten really busy with work and with boyfriends. Stephanie told her roommates she'd be back in a couple of minutes, and then she went to her bedroom. There, she changed out of her work clothes and put on a t-shirt and jeans. It was Friday, but she and her roommates did not have any big plans. They were just going to hang out at home together. After getting changed, Stephanie grabbed the cordless phone off her bedside table and she called her boyfriend, Walter Robinson. Walter and Stephanie had been together for 4 years, and they were planning on getting married someday. Walter had even bought Stephanie a promise ring, which is a piece of jewelry that typically precedes an engagement ring. Walter picked up the phone on the other end, and he and Stephanie talked about how their days had gone. Stephanie's face lit up whenever she talked to Walter, and she was always happiest when she was with him. But at the time, they couldn't really be together nearly as much as they wanted to because Walter had moved to South Carolina for grad school. They were only about a 4-hour drive from each other, and they would go back and forth to see each other all the time. But that wasn't enough for Stephanie. She wanted to live with Walter and be with him all the time. So recently, she had made the decision to move to South Carolina as well. And she and Walter had already begun looking for an apartment they could share. On the phone, Stephanie told Walter how much she missed him, and he reminded her that she would be in South Carolina before she knew it, and everything would be perfect. Stephanie told Walter that she loved him and then hung up the phone. She was a bit sad when she had to say goodbye, but her roommates were waiting for her in the living room, and they could always cheer her up. That night, Stephanie and her roommates ate dinner, they watched TV, and basically just made each other laugh for hours. Stephanie knew her friends were going to miss her when she moved to South Carolina, but they were also really excited that she was about to take this next big step in her life. A few hours later, Stephanie and her roommates were still sitting in the living room when there was a knock at the door. They weren't expecting anyone, but they lived in the type of apartment complex where neighbors would sometimes drop by to borrow things like sugar or laundry detergent. So Stephanie got off the couch and walked over to the door and opened it up. And standing on the other side was one of her neighbors, a middle-aged guy she knew pretty well, and he looked very shaken. Stephanie's roommates joined Stephanie at the door to see what was going on. Stephanie asked the neighbor if everything was okay, and the man just shook his head and said no. He said he had been walking by outside when he saw something moving in their bushes. It was dark out, and the lights at the apartment were not very bright, so at first he thought it might just be an animal. But as he got closer, he said he saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt, and that the man's face was pressed up against Stephanie's bedroom window. When the neighbor had called out to him, this peeping Tom had run off, so the neighbor didn't get a good look at him. When Stephanie heard this, she felt a chill run down her spine. Earlier that night, she'd been in her room taking off her work clothes, and she pictured this guy in this hooded sweatshirt just standing there watching her. The neighbor told them he had reported the incident to the apartment manager, but he said Stephanie and her roommates really needed to be extra careful to always lock their doors and keep their blinds closed. They thanked the neighbor for letting them know, and then as soon as he left, Stephanie shut and locked the door. Then the three roommates just stood there in the living room, kind of stunned by what they had just learned. They knew their apartments were not the nicest place to live or anything, but they'd always felt safe here. Now they had to worry about some pervert peeking into their windows and trying to watch them undress. A few minutes later, Stephanie went back into her bedroom. Immediately, she adjusted the blinds on the window so nobody would be able to look in from the outside. Then she thought about maybe telling her boyfriend, Walter, or her dad about what had just happened. She knew they both prided themselves on being strong Southern gentlemen who protected women, but in this case, Stephanie felt like there really wasn't anything either of them could do. The incident had already been reported, and knowing about it would just make her father and Walter angry and upset. And so Stephanie told herself everything would be fine, and in just a couple of months, she'd be long gone to South Carolina, far away from this apartment and the creep who tried to spy on her. On May 20th, 2002, so almost a month after the Peeping Tom incident, Stephanie was getting back home from work again. She got out of her car and she saw people walking around the lake like usual, but this night she didn't stop to talk to any dogs or any of her neighbors. Instead, she went straight to her apartment. The truth was, Stephanie had been feeling anxious and upset all day. The weekend before, she had gone to South Carolina to see her boyfriend, Walter, and it was the happiest she had been in weeks because they had found the perfect apartment. But when it was time for her to drive back home, Stephanie had broken down in tears and told Walter that she just wanted to stay with him. She didn't want to leave. He said he felt the same way, but he reminded her that she'd be back here for good in only a month, and that the time between now and then would fly by. Stephanie knew he was right, but she still felt like every day she spent in Raleigh was a day she wasn't as happy as she could be. And so Stephanie walked into her apartment and quickly closed and locked the door behind her, and right away she had to admit to herself that there was actually another reason she was feeling so anxious. Both of her roommates were out of town. And since she'd learned about the Peeping Tom a month earlier, she had hated being alone in this apartment. Without her roommates there, the place just felt empty. It felt too quiet. So Stephanie turned on the TV just for some background noise. Then she made herself dinner, sat down on the couch, and watched TV while she ate. At about 8 p.m., so a couple of hours after she'd gotten home, Stephanie called Walter from the living room. And they talked about all the things they were going to put in their new apartment to make it really feel like home. Talking to Walter definitely cheered Stephanie up, but she was still dreading sleeping in her apartment by herself. So after she hung up with her boyfriend, Stephanie made herself a cup of tea, which she'd always been told was good to calm the nerves. She took her tea into the bedroom, but left her bedroom door open a crack. She just wanted to make sure she could hear any noises coming from other parts of her apartment. Stephanie then put her cup of tea down on the bedside table, and then glanced over at the window to make sure the blinds were still closed. When she saw they were, she felt comfortable, so she got undressed, put on a nightgown, and climbed into bed. Then she reached over and took a sip of her tea, and then picked up a book and read for a bit. After finally feeling relaxed, Stephanie put the book down, flipped off the light, and began to fall asleep. The following afternoon, Stephanie's boyfriend, Walter, came out of one of his grad school classes and immediately began scrolling through his contact list on his phone. Walter and Stephanie talked almost every morning before she went to work and he went to class. But that morning, Stephanie had not answered her phone when he called. Walter hadn't thought much about it. There was a chance that maybe Stephanie had been getting ready for work or that she'd gone in early. But Walter had tried calling a few more times since then, and he had sent Stephanie a couple of emails, but he still hadn't heard back. Walter was getting worried. It was just weird for Stephanie not to respond to him at all. After scrolling for a minute, Walter finally found the number for one of Stephanie's roommates on his phone. Then he walked out of the building and called the friend while he headed to his car. Walter told the roommate what was going on, and the roommate said that Stephanie hadn't answered her phone when she called either, and so the roommate said that she was worried too. She told Walter she was out of town right now, but she'd called their apartment manager, and the manager could at least go by their place to just see if Stephanie was at home. Walter thanked the roommate and then tried to convince himself that everything was going to be okay. At 3:30 p.m., the apartment manager approached Stephanie's door. Stephanie's roommate had given the apartment manager permission to unlock the apartment and go inside. And so, after knocking and not getting an answer, the apartment manager pulled out a key and opened up the door and walked into the living room. And right away, nothing looked out of the ordinary. So she called out to see if anybody was home, but the place was silent. So the manager walked into the hallway that led to each of the 3 bedrooms. Stephanie's bedroom door was closed, but the door across the hall was open just a crack. So the manager walked down the hallway and looked through that crack into that room, and what she saw caused her to turn and run down the hall screaming. And then once she got outside, she frantically pulled out her phone and called 911. About 10 minutes after that 911 call, Lieutenant Chris Morgan, head of the Violent Crimes Task Force in Raleigh, put on his white fedora hat and walked out of his office. Lieutenant Morgan was a big guy, and he seemed even bigger when he spoke in his booming southern drawl. But it was really that white fedora, with its soft brim and indented crown, that made people always notice him wherever he went. In truth, Morgan had begun wearing the hat when he was a young investigator because he liked how it looked. It was a throwback to lawmen from an earlier time. But Morgan had proven to be a highly skilled detective, and the more crimes he solved, the more attached he became to this white hat. Over time, Morgan had started to see the hat as some kind of a magical charm that helped him close case after case. A little before 4 p.m., Morgan arrived at Stephanie's apartment. Other officers and crime scene analysts were already hard at work. One of the officers greeted the lieutenant and then quickly ushered him down the hallway to one of the bedrooms. Morgan stepped inside the bedroom and looked down at the floor. Right away, he took up his fedora and stood there respectfully for a full minute, not moving or talking. Everyone who worked with Morgan knew that his big outward persona was actually just a small part of who he was. Inside, Morgan was a highly empathetic person, and it was his empathy that really made him such a great cop. He had worked violent crimes for years, but he still felt heartbroken every time he saw a victim. Violent crimes were an attack on his community and a robbery of everything the victim would have experienced in their life. After his moment of silence was over, Morgan put his hat back on and crouched down to the floor. He was looking at one of the most gruesome crime scenes he'd ever witnessed. The young woman lying there had already been identified as Stephanie Bennett, and Stephanie was lying on her back, naked, with her arms and legs stretched out to the sides. There were ligature marks on her wrists and ankles from where she had clearly been tied up. There was a dark purple mark around her neck, and there was a pair of blue women's underwear stuffed inside of her mouth. Lieutenant Morgan was sure the mark on Stephanie's neck meant she had been strangled to death, but Morgan just couldn't get over how pronounced that mark on her neck was. Whoever had done this to Stephanie had inflicted as much pain on her as they possibly could. Then Lieutenant Morgan called over one of the crime scene analysts. He wanted confirmation of something he already knew to be true. He told the analyst he believed there were clear signs of sexual assault, and the analyst agreed. Morgan stood up. He felt angry and sick, but he knew that in the case of sexual assault, there would be DNA samples from the attacker on the victim's body, and that was evidence Morgan could use to catch the person who did this. Looking around the room, Morgan saw that the window was closed, but the window screen had been removed. He thought there was a chance that that window was how the killer had entered the apartment. But Morgan also noticed several photos on the wall in this room that were of a young woman who was not Stephanie, so he assumed that this was actually not Stephanie's bedroom. So Lieutenant Morgan walked to the bedroom across the hall, and right away he saw pictures of Stephanie and her friends and family in there, so he knew this was her room. And so for some reason, the killer had carried out their attack on Stephanie in her roommate's bedroom. Morgan thought, perhaps the killer just wanted to stay close to their exit route, which would be through the roommate's window. Morgan walked around Stephanie's bedroom, and the way it was decorated really hit him hard. There were stuffed animals on the bed and Harry Potter books on the shelves. All he could think was that Stephanie was barely older than a kid, and some horrible person had crept in here and taken everything from her. Morgan also started thinking about all the apartment complexes near the lake. They were home to a lot of other young women like Stephanie, so Morgan really had to act fast to make sure this did not happen to anyone else. At 9 a.m. the following morning, Lieutenant Morgan and his investigative team were back at Stephanie's apartment complex. They had only wrapped up their initial search a few hours earlier, so most of them had barely slept. but nobody would know that from looking at Morgan. He was full of energy when he walked around the complex to meet up with Stephanie's neighbors. He wanted to know if anybody had seen or heard something on the night of the murder. But nobody had noticed anything strange. In fact, it had been so quiet that the neighbors who shared a wall with Stephanie's bedroom said they hadn't heard any noise at all. Morgan had his team collect information on everybody they could find at the apartment complex. But because of the nature of the crime, the sexual assault and very violent murder, he figured they were looking for a man. Normally, Morgan's first suspect would have been Stephanie's boyfriend, Walter, because in the United States, almost 35% of female murder victims are killed by an intimate partner. But the night before, Morgan had contacted Walter in South Carolina, and the young man had completely broken down on the phone when he heard about what happened to his girlfriend. And Morgan's team was quickly able to locate multiple witnesses who had been with Walter at the time of the murder. So Morgan turned his attention to the men in Stephanie's apartment complex, and he found that almost every man his team spoke to was willing to provide DNA samples. In fact, just about everybody who had known Stephanie, even if they had barely known her, told police they would do whatever it took to help police find her killer. They just kept saying how kind Stephanie had been to everyone, that this just didn't make any sense. While members of Morgan's team collected DNA samples from Stephanie's male neighbors, Morgan met with residents who had not been home when police first arrived. And Morgan pretty quickly found someone who had information that could help. It was the neighbor who had warned Stephanie and her roommates about the peeping Tom a month earlier. The neighbor recounted his story about seeing the peeping Tom, but as hard as he tried, he really could not give Morgan much of a description. Then, Morgan spoke to another resident, a man with a very heavy Czech accent, who claimed to have also seen the peeping Tom. But, just like Stephanie's neighbor, the guy with the heavy Czech accent really did not get a good look at him. He just said the guy at Stephanie's window appeared to be white, so Caucasian, he was pretty big, and he appeared to have short hair. Morgan thanked both of the men for their help, because even without a detailed description from either one of them, they had actually given investigators a major lead here. And Morgan thought the killer could have been spying on Stephanie through her window for weeks or months, picturing her as their victim and devising their plan. So Morgan rounded up his team and told them to start looking for anyone who might fit the limited description they had of this peeping Tom. Then, Morgan returned to Stephanie's apartment to see if maybe there was anything he might have missed. But what Morgan didn't know was someone was watching him while he was doing this. They were hidden in the shadows of the parking lot, and they could see everything that was going on. After speaking to Stephanie's neighbors, Lieutenant Morgan had focused his investigation on finding this peeping Tom. But so far, police had come up empty in their search. Lieutenant Morgan encouraged his team to please remain patient because he believed the peeping Tom would slip up and they would eventually get him. Because Morgan was convinced this peeping Tom would not just stop with Stephanie, they would start looking for another victim. So Morgan had made sure to have officers on site at Stephanie's apartment complex and the other complexes nearby in case this peeping Tom started looking in other windows. On the night of June 3rd, so roughly 2 weeks after Stephanie was murdered, a young police officer was walking the grounds of one of the apartment complexes near Stephanie's. And suddenly, this officer heard something coming from the bushes a few yards away. The officer quickly crouched down behind a nearby wall so he'd be out of sight. And then the officer craned his neck around that wall, and he focused on the bushes, and there he saw a man standing in them looking through an apartment window. The young officer saw this man, this peeping Tom, lean his face right up against the glass, and then he also saw this peeping Tom undo his belt and then reach into his pants. The moment this happened, the young officer radioed for help and then got out from behind that wall and began sprinting towards this guy in the bushes. The peeping Tom heard the officer, turned, and started to run. The young officer sprinted after him, but the peeping Tom was fast. However, just then, 2 more officers came running out of the darkness from the other direction, and they leapt at this man and tackled him to the ground. The peeping Tom tried to break free, but the officers kept him pinned down and got him handcuffed. The young officer who originally spotted the peeping Tom eventually joined the other 2 officers totally out of breath, and then he called into the station and told Lieutenant Morgan they had finally caught the peeping Tom. And as the officers led the peeping Tom to a police cruiser, They had no idea there was somebody else nearby watching their every move. Later that night, the Peeping Tom sat in an interrogation room at the police station. In the hours following his arrest, police had been able to identify him as Christopher Campen. He was 34 years old, he had short hair that matched the description police had gotten, and he had an extensive criminal record. Christopher had been arrested multiple times on misdemeanor charges for, quote, secret peeping, end quote, also stalking, and also exposing himself. And those were all acts that police considered potential gateway crimes that could eventually lead someone to commit full-blown sexual assault or even murder. So, for the first time since Stephanie had been murdered, Lieutenant Morgan thought he had a real potential suspect here. Morgan stepped into the interrogation room and sat across from Christopher. Morgan took off his white fedora hat and put it down on the table, and then greeted Christopher in his booming voice. And that voice, and Morgan's sheer size, made Christopher immediately shift in his chair uncomfortably and look down at the floor. Morgan told Christopher that police knew all about his criminal history, and they knew that earlier that night he'd been spying on a young woman while she got into the shower. Then Morgan just sat back and stared at Christopher. And as he did, Christopher remained silent and just kept shifting around in his seat. Finally, Morgan just asked him if he knew Stephanie Bennett. Christopher immediately sat up straight in his chair, and a look of fear came across his face. He told Morgan he knew who Stephanie was. Basically everybody in Raleigh did, because the case was all over the news. But he said he actually didn't know her, and he didn't have anything to do with what had happened to her. Now, there was no denying what police had caught him doing that night, looking in the woman's window, but he said that did not mean he was also a murderer. Morgan nodded, and then asked Christopher some questions about his criminal history. But the more Christopher spoke, the more Lieutenant Morgan felt like something was off here. There was no question that everybody in the police department, including Morgan, hoped they had found Stephanie's killer when they brought Christopher in. After all, he was caught red-handed being a peeping Tom. He also roughly fit the description of the man who had been seen watching Stephanie through her window, but Morgan had made a long, successful career out of reading people, and he was right way more often than he was wrong. And listening to Christopher, he just did not think this guy could be behind the absolutely horrific crime scene he saw in Stephanie's apartment. A lot of organization and planning had gone into Stephanie's murder. Her killer had clearly been calculated and patient, and they had not left any discernible fingerprints anywhere. But the way Christopher spoke seemed completely scattered, not calm or organized at all. Morgan knew others in the investigation would not want to hear the theory that had just crossed Morgan's mind, that there might be two different peeping Toms in the apartment complexes near the lake, and that this one they had arrested was not the right one. It was not the murdering peeping Tom. Still, Lieutenant Morgan was a strong believer in science, so that night, police still charged Christopher with secret peeping and resisting arrest, and officers swabbed his cheeks to obtain DNA samples. Now they would have to wait to see if Christopher's DNA matched the DNA found on Stephanie's body. It only took a few days for Lieutenant Morgan to be proven right about Christopher. The DNA samples did not match those found at the crime scene. Christopher was indeed a peeping Tom, but he was not Stephanie's killer. Morgan, by this point, had been pretty sure that this would be the outcome, but he was still disappointed. He had stayed in close contact with Stephanie's family, and he had promised them that Stephanie's killer would be found. But now he was getting concerned, because they were weeks into this investigation, and he no longer had any legitimate leads. And not long after Christopher's DNA test results came in, Morgan got more bad news from the crime lab. The DNA samples found on Stephanie's body did not match any samples in the state or national DNA databases. In short, that meant that the one major piece of evidence investigators had found had not given them any idea who killed Stephanie. So Morgan went back to square one and just started re-interviewing residents at Stephanie's apartment complex. But he didn't discover anything that gave him the break in the case they desperately needed. On top of that, there was something else that kept gnawing at Morgan. almost every man who lived in the apartments had voluntarily provided DNA samples. But there were a few men who had refused. However, without just cause, Morgan couldn't force them to submit DNA samples. So he believed there was still a chance that someone who lived close to Stephanie was her killer. Police just needed something to point them in the right direction. They at least needed enough evidence to get a warrant to obtain the DNA samples they were missing. But after months of interviewing residents and monitoring the grounds, investigators still did not have anything to go on. And by the fall of 2002, Morgan knew the case was going cold. And as more time passed, he felt like he was failing Stephanie's family. Then 2002 came to an end, and then all of 2003 passed with no real progress on the case. Stephanie's story slowly disappeared from the media, and it almost seemed like the community had moved on. But Morgan was determined to keep the promise he'd made to Stephanie's family, even if he was not the one to solve Stephanie's murder. In April of 2004, almost 2 years after Stephanie's murder, Lieutenant Morgan called on Detective Ken Copeland to take over Stephanie's case. Copeland was a member of the Ha-il-Wa-Saponi Indian tribe, and he'd grown up in a rural area not far from Raleigh. He also was a former United States Marine who looked like he could punch a hole through a brick wall. But most importantly to Morgan, Detective Copeland was known around the department as the, quote, garbage man. Copeland was so detail-oriented that he would often find small pieces of evidence that other cops had just assumed were garbage. So Morgan knew that if anyone could discover something that he had missed, it would be Detective Copeland. After getting the assignment, Copeland immediately laid out a plan to re-interview as many people as he could at Stephanie's apartment complex who had been a part of the initial investigation. He hoped that somebody would have new information for him. The process was slow going, and getting people to help police again, years after the murder, was not always easy. But several residents did tell Copeland something that had not come up before. They said they remembered seeing someone that they didn't know who seemed to spend day after day after day just watching the police conduct their investigation during that initial investigation period. But nobody could give Copeland a decent description of this person because this person always seemed to be just out of sight or blending in with a crowd. Nothing Copeland heard was enough to give him a solid lead, but he was sure this was significant, and he wondered if maybe the killer had come back to the scene of the crime just to relish in what they had done. But even with this new information, Copeland did not rush to any conclusions. He was trying to rebuild this case from the ground up, and he was confident his method would pay off. And finally, in February of 2005, 10 months after Copeland had taken over the case, he caught a massive break. He was back at Stephanie's apartment complex to conduct another round of interviews when a man came running towards him, calling out in a strong Czech accent. The man was one of the people who had told police early on that he had seen the peeping Tom by Stephanie's window. The man came up to Copeland and just started talking right away, sounding very excited. He said he had remembered something, and it was very important. In fact, the man couldn't believe it had taken this long for him to remember this. He told Copeland that when the peeping Tom had run away from Stephanie's window, he'd headed towards the apartment complex that was just on the other side of the woods. Copeland felt a rush. Police had searched those apartments early on, but nothing had come of it, and Copeland had spent the bulk of his time focused on Stephanie's complex. Now suddenly, he had a strong feeling that he would find what he was looking for just beyond the woods. Copeland thanked the man with the Czech accent for his help and then headed toward the neighboring apartment complex. When he got there, he went right into the management office and he asked one question of the people in that office. Were there any residents in their building who made a practice out of spying on other residents? The people in the office didn't even hesitate. They said absolutely there was one person who did do that, and they pointed Copeland toward that person's apartment. Copeland's time as a U.S. Marine had enabled him to remain calm in even the most stressful situations. But in this moment, as he walked towards this apartment, he could feel his heart beating faster and faster. Copeland was sure that talking to whoever lived in this apartment would finally break this case wide open. Copeland finally arrived at the apartment, and after taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. A moment later, the person who lived there answered, and they were clearly intimidated by how big Copeland was. But Copeland smiled, introduced himself, and showed his badge, and the person let him inside. Copeland didn't waste any time. He asked this person right off the bat if they knew anything about Stephanie Bennett's murder. And within minutes, Copeland knew the case had its first real suspect in years. After that meeting, Detective Copeland followed up on some of the information he had just gotten. Then he rushed back to the police station and told Lieutenant Morgan he was sure they had a lead that would finally pan out. Morgan felt a mix of relief and urgency. Detective Copeland, the garbage man, had come through just like Morgan had hoped. But Morgan knew they had to make sure they had enough evidence to convict their new suspect in court. Copeland had gathered a lot of information that day, and so with Morgan's help, they were able to secure warrants that would allow police to conduct surveillance on their suspect and to obtain a DNA sample without the suspect's cooperation. After visiting the apartments near Stephanie's, Copeland had been trying to secure a DNA sample from their new suspect. But this suspect had stayed one step ahead of Copeland. This man somehow knew he was being pursued, and he seemed to be a master at covering his tracks. When the suspect went to restaurants, he always ate finger foods so he wouldn't leave prints on forks or knives. He also pocketed any straws he used, and he flushed his napkins down the toilet. At work, he wiped down his computer and desk every day, and he never disposed of anything in the trash can by his desk or in the dumpster outside the building. Detective Copeland knew the suspect was beating him, but he also knew the suspect's one small weakness. The man had a sweet tooth. The suspect's boss had told Copeland that the man often ate ice cream and other snacks at work, so Copeland had come up with a last-ditch effort to get a DNA sample. He had asked the suspect's boss to arrange a lunch for her entire department, and he had asked the boss to do something important at that lunch. So, on September 15th, 2005, almost 3.5 years after Stephanie's murder, 2 members of Copeland's team were dressed in plain clothes, sitting inside of a Golden Corral restaurant. The officers watched from across the restaurant as the suspect's boss walked up to the buffet line and grabbed a tray and put some banana pudding on it. The tray trembled in the boss's hands because she was so nervous, but she did the very important thing Copeland had asked her to do. She put that dessert tray right on the table in front of the suspect, and the suspect took the bait. They grabbed a banana pudding, and then he picked up a fork and began eating. After a few bites, the suspect wiped the fork down with a napkin and put the napkin in his pocket, but the suspect left the fork on the table. Minutes later, the suspect walked out of the restaurant, and at that point, the 2 plainclothes officers rushed over to the table and bagged the fork as evidence. And that fork would provide a DNA sample that would eventually allow police to determine who had killed Stephanie. Based on interviews, DNA samples, and evidence found at the crime scene, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Stephanie Bennett on the night of May 20th and the early morning of May 21st in 2002. The sun was shining bright when the killer walked from his apartment complex over to Stephanie's. He was carrying a duffel bag on his shoulder, he tucked his long hair under the hood of his black sweatshirt, and he kept his hands in his sweatshirt pocket so nobody would see the latex gloves he was wearing. The killer scanned the grounds to make sure nobody was nearby, and he saw that everything was clear. He'd chosen this time to come because he knew most people would still be at work and not out walking on the footpaths near the lake. The killer moved quickly towards the high bushes in front of Stephanie's roommate's bedroom window. He crouched down, climbed through the bushes, and then removed the window screen. The window itself was locked, but the killer knew it was not that secure. And so he grabbed the bottom of the window with his gloved hands, used all of his strength, and he forced it open. Once it was open, the killer climbed into the roommate's bedroom and closed the window behind him. He walked across the bedroom, opened the door halfway, and looked across the hall at Stephanie's room. The door was closed. Satisfied, the killer turned back around and went inside of one of the roommate's closets, and once he was inside, he positioned the door so it was barely open a crack so he could still listen to what was going on in the apartment, and then the killer put his bag on the closet floor He sat down and he waited for hours. Finally, at about 6 p.m., the killer heard the front door unlock and open. He held his breath. He knew he still had to wait just a bit longer. The killer heard the TV turn on in the living room, then he smelled food cooking in the kitchen, and he listened as Stephanie spoke on the phone. All the while, the killer just kept breathing slowly so he would stay calm and patient. Finally, hours after Stephanie had gotten home, the killer heard her coming down the hall. From his spot in the closet, he not only could see Stephanie walk into her bedroom, but he could see her in the bedroom. She left her bedroom door open. So the killer watched Stephanie as she got undressed and put on her nightgown. Then he saw Stephanie grab a book and get under her covers, and he waited while she read. Then the killer saw the light go off in Stephanie's bedroom, and he felt a jolt of adrenaline. It was time to go. The killer grabbed his bag, stepped out of the closet, and then placed the bag down right in the middle of the bedroom floor. Then he rushed out of the room, he went across the hall, he slammed open Stephanie's door, and he leapt onto the bed, pinning Stephanie down. Stephanie was in complete shock and terror, but the killer just pushed one hand over her mouth to keep her quiet, and he used the other hand to hit her multiple times. Stephanie was stunned and already bleeding. With one hand continuing to cover Stephanie's mouth, the killer pulled her off of her bed and dragged her across the hall into her roommate's bedroom where he had left the bag. Stephanie fought back and tried to break free, but the killer was so strong and he held her down and managed somehow to keep her totally silent. The killer dragged Stephanie into the center of the room, and then he reached over into his bag and took out several pieces of rope. And then using that rope, the killer quickly bound Stephanie's wrists behind her back, and then he pushed her onto the ground, and then he used the other piece of rope to bind her ankles, and then once she was all tied up, he removed all of her clothing, and then he shoved her underwear into her mouth to gag her. Then the killer left Stephanie on the floor of the roommate's bedroom, and then the killer crossed the hallway back into Stephanie's bedroom. And there, the killer went into Stephanie's dresser and looked through her clothes and eventually removed a piece of Stephanie's underwear. This would be his trophy. After that, the killer walked out of Stephanie's room, closed the door, and then went back into the room where Stephanie was bound and gagged on the ground. The killer placed his trophy inside of his bag and then turned his attention to Stephanie. The killer raped Stephanie. And then after he was done, he reached into his bag again and pulled out a long metal wire. He leaned over Stephanie, wrapped that wire around her neck, and slowly strangled her to death. After she was dead, the killer just stared at Stephanie's body for a whole minute. Then he threw the wire back into his bag and also cut the restraints off of her wrists and ankles and threw that rope back into the bag as well. Then the killer picked up the bag, climbed back out the window he had come in through, and ran across the dark apartment complex towards the woods. A few minutes later, he arrived at his apartment, he opened the door, and the second he did, he was greeted by his very friendly and extremely happy-looking black and brown Rottweiler. It would turn out that Stephanie's murderer was someone she had met before, but only very briefly. His name was Drew Planton, and he was the owner of that very happy-looking Rottweiler that Stephanie had noticed and gone up to and crouched down and pet after coming home from work about a month before her murder. And that was it. That was Stephanie's entire connection to Drew. But for Drew, that small chance encounter had been enough. And not long after that interaction, Drew had begun to stalk Stephanie and spy on her through her windows when she was in her bedroom. And finally, Drew had decided Stephanie would be his next murder victim. Because it would also turn out that Drew Planton had very likely killed before. Police would discover that years earlier, he had very likely murdered an exotic dancer in Lansing, Michigan, but the case had gone unsolved. However, everybody involved in that case fully believed Drew was the killer. Drew was not on Lieutenant Morgan and his team's radar at first because he had moved out of the apartment complex near Stephanie's not long after the murder, and he didn't really fit the description of the peeping Tom they had been given. He was tall, but he was gangly and had long, shaggy hair. Also, Drew was a well-respected chemist in Raleigh who did not seem to fit the initial criminal profile. But everything changed when the garbage man, Detective Copeland, took over. When Copeland learned that the killer had most likely lived in the apartment complex near Stephanie's, and that someone who Stephanie's neighbors didn't recognize had been watching the police from a distance, he had an idea. Copeland did not like to stereotype people, but as someone who'd grown up in the rural South, he believed every community had a busybody who made it their job to know everybody else's business. So he went to the apartment complex where he believed the killer lived, and he asked the office workers which resident spent the most of their time keeping tabs on their neighbors. And they immediately pointed him to one of the residents' apartments. But Copeland was not talking to the killer inside of that apartment. He was talking to a woman who regularly spied on her neighbors and who knew everything about all of them. And it turned out she was the person who had spent a lot of time lurking around the apartment complexes near the lake, watching the police investigation unfold. And that woman told Copeland he really needed to talk to Drew Planton, a man who used to live in an apartment close to hers and who had a pet Rottweiler. She said Drew had always creeped her out, but more importantly, she had seen him several times before the murder, hanging around near the apartment where Stephanie would be killed. And Copeland got confirmation from a few of Stephanie's neighbors, including the man with the heavy Czech accent, that they had often seen a man walking a Rottweiler around their apartment complex, and there was a chance that man could have been the peeping Tom they saw outside of Stephanie's window. So Copeland came to believe that Drew was very likely Stephanie's killer. Drew was able to elude police for a while, but eventually his love of sugar brought him down. Copeland knew nobody would eat banana pudding with their hands, so he set up his sting operation with Drew's boss, and sure enough, a partial DNA sample taken from the fork Drew used to eat the pudding showed that he was most likely Stephanie's killer. And that was enough to convince Drew's boss to continue helping the police, and she would ultimately secure a pair of gloves Drew had used at work before he could throw them away. And those gloves provided police with a more complete DNA sample that would be strong enough to hold up in court, and that did make it clear that Drew really had murdered Stephanie. In court, Drew Planton refused to walk, speak, or even open his eyes. He acted like he was in a totally catatonic state. But Drew was not catatonic, and ultimately he would commit suicide in jail before a verdict could be handed down. Brittany Norwood was born in 1982 in Federal Way, Washington, which is a small city located about 20 miles south of Seattle. Growing up, Brittany's family never had much money. Her father, who was the primary breadwinner, ran a small upholstery shop in town, and while he worked tirelessly, he barely earned enough money to make ends meet. And considering how large Brittany's family was, she was one of 9 siblings, the lack of financial resources at times made life very challenging. However, Brittany's parents were not complainers, and they instilled in all of their children the importance of hard work regardless of circumstance. And clearly that message resonated with their children because by the time Brittany was a teenager, her older siblings had already gone on to become doctors, engineers, and management consultants. As for Brittany, she was just as ambitious as her older siblings, but her interests were in athletics. By the time she was in high school, she had become one of the very best soccer players in the entire state of Washington. She was so good, in fact, that by her senior year of high school in 2000, the best college soccer programs in America were actively recruiting her. She would finally settle on attending Stony Brook University in Long Island, New York, because they offered her a fantastic scholarship and they were known for their excellent soccer program. Brittany was incredibly proud of her scholarship. It not only represented the hard work pays off motto that her parents had preached all of her life, but it also lifted a serious financial burden off of her parents. So in the fall of 2000, Brittany left Washington State and headed east to New York to begin her collegiate career. But right away, she struggled. Brittany had never left home before, and now she was suddenly 3,000 miles away from her family and her friends, and she missed them terribly. Within the first few days of being at her new school, she called her family and told them how much she missed them and how she kind of regretted coming to New York in the first place, but they reassured her that she had made the right choice, that these feelings were normal, and she just needed to give it some time. But despite taking her family's advice and sticking it out at Stony Brook, Brittany never really felt like she belonged there. She made friends, she got good grades, and performed well on the soccer team, But with every passing semester, Brittany became less and less connected to the school and the people there and just longed to be home. And so with that in mind, in 2003, so 3 years after she had arrived at Stony Brook, Brittany was at her school feeling down about her situation when she had a serious lapse in judgment. Brittany, who had never gotten in trouble in her life before, randomly stole one of her teammates' things out of their locker. She didn't even know why she did it. It just kind of happened, and then pretty much immediately she got caught. And as soon as she returned what she had taken. She felt horrible and she apologized, but the damage was done. The incident had already been reported to the school, and the school had a very strict code of conduct policy, which theft was in clear violation of. And so Brittany had her scholarship revoked, and without it, her family could no longer afford the school, and so she had to come back home. And when she got home, she felt like she had let her entire family down. And so for the next several years, the shadow of this huge mistake loomed over her like a dark cloud. She just kind of kept her head down and took part-time work here and there, but for the most part, while she was home, she was just sad and directionless. But finally, in 2010, so 7 years after coming home from school, when Brittany was now 28 years old, she decided enough was enough. She was going to stop letting this mistake define her life. She was going to go out and find a career and make something of her life, like her other siblings had. And the career move that seemed to make the most sense to her was becoming a personal trainer. Despite not playing soccer anymore, fitness was still a very big part of her life, and she loved the idea of helping other people get fit and stay fit. And so she began looking at where personal trainers were the most in demand, and she found Washington, D.C. was a total hotspot, and it just so happened 2 of her siblings were already living there. And so that year, she packed up her stuff and she headed out to D.C. as well. When she got there, she had a little cash, but not enough to sustain her longer than a month or 2, so she applied for and got a job with a Lululemon shop. Lululemon is a company that sells yoga athletic apparel. The shop was located in Bethesda, which is a very wealthy suburb of Washington, D.C., and right around the corner from the shop was a gym that Brittany immediately fell in love with and decided would be the perfect gym for her to run her personal training practice out of once she got certified. So a very happy and rejuvenated Brittany began work at the Lululemon shop in Bethesda in late 2010, fully expecting to only be there for a few months before she transitioned to her personal training career. At around the same time Brittany began working at the store, another young woman had started working there as well. Her name was Jana Murray, and she was quite similar to Brittany. She was 30, so 2 years older than Brittany, and she had been raised in a close-knit, modest household in Texas where her parents had preached always working hard and doing the right thing, and she really took that to heart. And like Brittany, Jana was also a star high school athlete, except instead of playing soccer, she was a big track and field star. And actually, she set some records in Texas for the discus throw. But after graduating high school, instead of pursuing athletics in college, Jana had pursued business. She enrolled in the business program at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. After she graduated, she worked in the private sector for a few years before deciding it made sense for her to go back to school to earn her master's degree in business. She was accepted to the very prestigious Johns Hopkins Business School, which was located a few miles from the Lululemon shop where Brittany worked. And by 2010, Jana was in her final semester, and all she had left to complete was a final thesis paper. A thesis is a long essay involving personal research. The assignment was to write about the structure of a company of her choosing. And since Jana was a huge fan of Lululemon apparel, she had decided to write about them. And during her research on Lululemon, she discovered that the company was far more than just clothing. They had what seemed to be a really cool company culture. All employees, no matter how junior, were encouraged to pursue whatever goals they had, even if their goals meant leaving Lululemon at some point. It was like the company fundamentally cared more about their people than their product. And Jana loved that. And so as she's writing this paper, on a whim, she decides to go get a job at a Lululemon store. And the nearest location was the one near her school. Jana figured working at the shop would only make it easier to finish her thesis, since it would provide her boots-on-the-ground information. Also, she just wanted to see for herself if this company was as amazing as it seemed to be. And so her plan was just to work at this shop until her thesis was done, at which point she'd earn her master's and more than likely she would quit and move on with her life. So in late 2010, when Brittany and Jana found themselves working at the same Lululemon shop in Bethesda, they were aware of each other, but really didn't know each other. Their only interactions were when their shifts happened to overlap, which did not happen very often. But when it did, they were perfectly nice to each other. They would chit-chat, but they were coworkers, not really friends. However, a terrifying event was about to link them together forever. On the evening of March 11th, 2011, Jana and Brittany were working together at the Lululemon. It was an uneventful shift. They chatted, they helped customers, and in between all of that, they would knock out whatever closing duties they were responsible for so that when closing time came, they could leave quickly. And then when it was closing time at 8 p.m., the pair did one last sweep of the store to make sure everything was neat and put away and locked, and then they both grabbed their things and headed out the front door. Once they were outside, Jana turned around and she pulled the keys out of her pocket and she locked the front door. And then Jana hopped in her car and she drove off. And Brittany, she turned and began walking down the sidewalk toward the metro train station. But after only a few minutes of walking, Brittany swung her backpack off of her shoulder right in front of her, and she reached inside to fish around for her wallet because her metro train pass was inside of her wallet. And so she's fishing around her bag, she's still walking towards the train, and she can't find it. And so she comes to a full stop, she unzips her bag completely, and she looks inside, and her wallet is not in there. And as soon as she sees that it's missing, she remembers she left it on the break room table at the Lululemon store. And the only way she could go back and get her wallet was if Jana came back with the keys and unlocked the front door. And so Brittany just stood there for a minute wondering what she should do. She kind of felt bad about calling Jana to drive back and open the store for her, but she really needed her wallet for a whole bunch of reasons. And so finally, she picks up her cell phone and she calls Jana. And when Jana picks up, Brittany says, I'm really sorry, but I left my wallet in the store. Would you mind coming back and just opening the doors for me? I'll run in and I'll get it. Be super quick. And Jana, surprisingly, was totally fine with this. She actually laughed and said, I left my laptop in the break room and I was going to get it tomorrow, but this is an excuse to go back and get it now. And so Jana told Brittany she would be back at the front of the store in just a couple of minutes. And so Brittany thanked her, they hung up the phone, and then Brittany turned and she began running back towards Lululemon. When Brittany arrived at the front of the store, Jana was already there, and Brittany immediately said, "I'm so sorry, thank you so much for coming back." And Jana said, "Really, it's no big deal." And then Jana pulled her key out and she opened the front door of the store and they stepped inside. The layout of the store was basically just a big square where the front door entered the square right in the middle of it. So you step inside, you're in this kind of main shopping area. It's just this one square. And then all the way at the back, kind of lined up with the front door, behind the cash registers, was this employee-only hallway that went straight back about 7 or 8 feet. And then it reached this T intersection where if you turned left, there would be another hallway that went straight for maybe 10 or 15 feet, and it would come to a dead end at a door, and that door would lead to a bathroom. And then if you were standing in front of that bathroom door and looked left, there would be another door that led into a very small kitchen. And then if you went back to the T intersection and turned right and looked straight ahead, you would see another stretch of hallway that was about 10 or 15 feet long, and it would look exactly like the left hallway, except at the end of the right hallway, there was no door to a bathroom. It was just kind of a dead end. But at the end of the right hallway, if you walked all the way down it and then turned right, you would see there was a door that led into the break room. So the break room and the kitchen were kind of oriented in the same position at either ends of each hallway. And so the two women go inside the store with Brittany in the front. They get inside, Jana flips on the lights, and they walk across that square main shopping area. They go past the cash registers into that employee-only hallway. They go straight down, they turn right, they make their way down the right hallway, and then they open the door to the break room, and they go inside. Brittany very quickly found her wallet. It was on the table. She grabbed it. And so after she had her wallet, she just left the break room and began walking back out towards the main shopping area and the front door. Jana was only a couple of seconds behind her. She grabbed her laptop and then she left the break room. She walked back down the hallway. And as she turned back into the main shopping area, she kind of had her head down. She was fiddling with her laptop and her phone. But even though she wasn't looking up, just looking down, she could tell right in front of her, Brittany had come to a full stop in the middle of the main shopping area. And so as soon as she saw that, she stopped what she was doing and she looked up. And immediately she could see why Brittany had come to a stop. there were now 2 men wearing all black with black ski masks on that were standing between them and the front door. The following morning, the Lululemon employee who was supposed to come in that morning and open the store and work that day, she turns onto the street that the shop is on and she begins walking towards the front door. It's a bright, beautiful, sunny morning. There are lots of people out going about their daily routines. And so this employee, she walks right up to the front door of the Lululemon. She's not really looking into the store. She's kind of got her head down and she fishes in her pocket. She pulls out her key that opens the front door. She slots it into the lock and she turns it to unlock it. And right away, she feels no resistance. The door was already unlocked. And so this really gets her attention and she looks up, but there's a glare on the glass from the sunlight, so she can't see inside. And so she just pulls the key out of the lock and then she pushes open the door and she takes a very tentative step inside. And right away she sees the entire store is destroyed. There are shelves knocked over, there's clothing everywhere, it's a complete mess. And before she can even process what she's seeing, she hears what sounds like moaning coming from the back of the store, basically back in those hallways. And so this employee is terrified, and instead of going in to investigate, she just turns around and leaves the store and immediately calls 911. And as she's on the phone with police, this man who just happened to be walking by at this moment, he saw her and saw how visibly upset she was. And so he just stood next to her and waited for her to get off the phone with the police. And then when she was, he asked her, what's going on? And she would explain that the door was unlocked, the store is a complete disaster, and I heard moaning inside and I'm too scared to go in. And so the man says, hey, I'm gonna go in there and take a look around because I'm worried there could be someone who's hurt who needs our help right now before the police even get here. And so this man walks through the front door of the Lululemon, and right away, as soon as he steps in, he steps on broken glass and he looks up and the store is completely destroyed. Everything's knocked over. And he immediately hears the moaning coming from the back of the store. And so he very carefully starts walking straight ahead through the store, stepping over shelves that have been knocked down and trying hard not to destroy any merchandise that's on the ground. And when he reaches the back of the store, basically the entrance to this employee hallway that goes straight back, he hears the moaning, but he can't really tell which hallway it's coming from. And so he just calls out like, hey, who's back there? Do you need my help? But there was no reaction. And so he begins walking forward and then he stops. He realizes the ground is slick. And so he looks down and he sees there's a very obvious blood trail from where he is standing straight back down this employee hallway. And the blood trail appears to turn right and kind of disappears out of sight down that right hallway. And so the man is terrified. He turns around and he looks towards the front of the store, kind of hoping that maybe the police or the paramedics would get there. But it's just the employee he had spoken to, and she looks terrified. And so the man decides, if there's someone hurt back here, I really need to go see what's wrong. And so very carefully, he begins walking down this initial hallway, following the blood trail. And then he turns right into that right hallway and he looks, and he can't believe what he is seeing. It looks like the entire right stretch of hallway was covered in blood. I mean, the floors, the walls, the ceilings, everything. There is blood everywhere. However, there's no person. It looks like all this blood kind of turns right and goes into the door at the end of the right hallway, the break room. And so this man knows, okay, obviously someone is very badly hurt, and whoever is moaning is almost certainly in that break room. And so he calls out again to see if this person will call back to him, but it's silent. And so he walks down this right hallway that's soaked in blood, and he gets to the end and he turns right and he grabs the handle of the break room door. He turns the handle and he pushes the door open. And at first he couldn't quite open it. There was something blocking the door from opening, but finally he kind of muscles it open enough that he can look inside, and he realizes what was blocking the door. There was a young woman lying face down on the ground, and her legs had been blocking the door. And this woman was Jaina. And this man, who was not medically trained, immediately understood this woman is deceased. The injuries she has sustained are so bad, there is absolutely no way she is alive. And he immediately thought, she also has likely been dead for some time. This does not look like it just happened. And so he's thinking, who's moaning? Where's the moaning coming from? Is there somebody else in this room? And so he pushes and kind of moves her body out of the way and sticks his head into the break room, and he scans around, but there's no one else in there. But as he's looking around, he hears the moaning again, and he realizes it's coming from the other side of the hallway, at the end of the left hallway. And so he shuts the break room door and he walks back up the hallway to the T intersection. And instead of turning and walking into the main shop, he continues down the left hallway. And he goes all the way down until he's standing in front of the door that leads into the bathroom, and to his left is the door that leads to that kitchen. And as he's standing there, he just kind of yells out, "Hey, whoever's in here, say something," because he doesn't know what door they're in, and he hears the moaning, and it's coming from the door right in front of him, the bathroom door. And so he opens the bathroom door, and immediately he's struck by all the blood all over the bathroom. And lying on her back on the ground is another young woman. It was Brittany. Her hands were zip tied together and attached to a pipe on the side of the room, and she was covered in blood. There were obvious stab wounds and slash marks and bruises all over her. And at first, this man assumed she must be deceased, and there must be a third person in this bathroom who's doing the moaning. But then he was startled when Brittany made this low, guttural moaning sound, almost like the sound of an animal dying. And he realized that was the moaning he was hearing. It was Brittany. At that moment, the police had arrived. They had rushed inside. They grabbed this man and escorted him out. They secured the scene, and then the paramedics came in, and they would confirm that unfortunately Jana was deceased. And then when they went to Brittany, they found that she was still clinging to life. And so they put her up onto a stretcher and they began wheeling her out. And as she was being brought out of the store, the paramedics began trying to talk to her. And Brittany, amazingly, was able to say a few words. The police, who are also on the scene, they see this, and they're concerned that, she might pass away from her injuries before they get to talk to her. And so sensing she was able to talk, they kind of rushed over as she's being loaded into the ambulance out front, and they would say, "Hey, do you remember anything about what happened to you and the other woman who was in there?" And Brittany was able to tell them that the night before there had been these two men who were wearing all black. They had ski masks on, so they didn't know what they looked like, and they had robbed the store, and then they had sexually assaulted both of the women. But Jana had apparently fought back so fiercely that they had killed her before they left. And so after she tells police this, the ambulance gets shut up and she's taken away to the hospital. And then the police immediately go into the Lululemon store to get the security footage from inside the shop to see if they can get some footage of the attack and see what happened. But unfortunately, the only camera this store had was on the exterior of the back of the building, just kind of looking out at a parking lot. There were no cameras looking in the store or at the front of the store. You have to remember, Bethesda, where the store was located, was considered to be extremely safe, very low crime neighborhood. And so more than likely, that was why this store did not have a security system. And so very frustrated, the police pulled up the only footage they could, which was this exterior camera. And sure enough, the night before, around midnight, the camera picked up two men wearing all black with their hoods up, running away from the store. And so there was really no way to identify who they were. All they could tell was, one was fairly tall. But nonetheless, they pulled the footage and they gave it to the media. And then that day and into the night, the local news played this footage on repeat, asking people in the area to come forward if they know who these two guys are. But by the next day, when the media and the police investigation had turned up nothing on these two guys, the police added a $150,000 reward for any information about who these two guys were. But after 48 hours since the discovery of this crime, still no one had come forward with any meaningful information about who these guys were, and so the police were kind of at a dead end. And so some of the detectives decided to go back to the Lululemon shop to walk the crime scene again to see if maybe something was missed in the initial search. And so the police, they come back to the shop, and it's being guarded 24/7 by police at this point. There's yellow crime scene tape outside blocking people off. And so the detectives arrive, they go underneath the yellow tape, they go past the security, they go inside, and then one of the detectives just walks straight to the back of the store and just kind of stands there near the registers looking around. And as he was looking around, he began looking at all of the bloody footprints that were on the ground. Now, by this point, all of the prints had been accounted for except for one set. There was a men's size 14 shoe print that had been spotted in several locations in the store, and it was just kind of assumed that it belonged to one of the killers. The thing about this print was that the treads of this shoe were fairly unique. They had a distinctive and fairly easy to recognize pattern to them. The police knew about this shoe print, but to be honest, they hadn't given it much thought because they felt like the print only seemed to confirm that a relatively tall man had been involved in this crime. But as this one detective stood in the back of the store and was just kind of looking around, he noticed a bin of shoes on the ground in the store. These shoes were there for shoppers to put them on when they were getting their pants hemmed and fitted to them. These shoes were not for sale. They were just kind of random shoes that were there effectively as props to make sure people's clothes fit properly. And the detective noticed one of the shoes at the top of the pile in this bin appeared to be a large men's shoe. And so purely out of curiosity, he reached down and he flipped the shoe over to look at the treads. And to his shock, they were an exact match to the unique treads on the size 14 bloody print. But the shoes he was holding were clean. There was no blood on them. So the detectives, they kind of all converge on the shoe, and they're thinking to themselves, did the attackers come in barefoot and perpetrate this attack with store shoes on and then afterwards clean them and leave them behind? Or is it just a crazy coincidence that one of the attackers happened to have the exact same style shoe and size as the one in this bin? They had no idea, but they felt like this was significant and they needed to get to the bottom of why this kind of random shoe in the store matched this print. And they thought the only person who might have more information about what the killer's shoes looked like would be Brittany. And so at this point, Brittany was still in very rough shape, but she had stabilized to the point where the police felt comfortable speaking to her. And so they paid her a visit and they asked her if she could remember anything about her attacker's feet. Did they wear shoes? And if so, what color were they? Anything she could remember at this point would be helpful. But Brittany would say, no, I'm sorry, I don't remember their feet at all. But there was something about the way she just very quickly dismissed the shoes that tipped the police off that maybe Brittany could be hiding something. But the police didn't press her because they knew she had just been in this horrific attack, and they also didn't really have a good sense of what her normal behavior looked like. So they just thanked her and they left. They were planning to speak to her again the following day, but she actually got in touch with them first and offered to have a meeting to go over what happened. And from the sound of her voice, it just sounded like she was just eager to help them. And so the police, they sat down with Brittany again, and they began talking about what happened and kind of going over the details. And they asked her again about the shoes. And again, she said she just didn't know. And then at some point in this second discussion they're having, Brittany kind of offhandedly mentioned something that she believes is just a small detail. But that small detail would ultimately be the thing that would lead police to figure out what actually happened on the night Jana was killed. This is what happened. Back on March 11th, 2011, so the night of the attack, Jana and Brittany were working in the store. It was a normal shift. Everything was fine. And then at closing time, they did their duties. They walked outside. Jana locked the front door, and then they said their goodbyes and they went their separate ways. Jana drove off in her car and Brittany began walking to the metro train station. But Brittany realized she had left her wallet in the break room, and so she called Jana. And Jana would tell Brittany that it was no big deal because she had left her laptop in the break room. Back at the front of the store, Jana double parked her car out on the street, and then she and Brittany headed inside the shop. Brittany would lead the way to the break room at the end of the hallway on the right, and after she got her wallet, Brittany would turn around and leave the break room ahead of Jana to make her way back out to the main shopping area. And so Jana was only a few seconds behind Brittany. She was just getting her laptop, and then when she had it, she left the break room, she walked down the hallway, and she turned and began walking into the main shopping area as well. And she had her head down. She was just kind of fiddling with her phone and her laptop. But at some point, she realized, even without looking up, that Brittany had come to a full stop in the middle of the shopping area. So Jana looks up, and there were not two men wearing all black with black ski masks blocking their way to the front door. In fact, there were no men involved in what happened next at all. The two men that had been seen on the security camera in the back of the building were just two cooks who happened to be hustling by the night of the attack and who happened to be wearing all black. It was just a coincidence. But there was someone standing in the store blocking Jana from leaving. It was Brittany. Brittany was staring at Jana, and in her hand was a foot-long square metal rod. It was one of the pieces of metal that normally was anchored into the walls of the store to hold up merchandise. Jana is so caught off guard by this, she has no idea what the issue is. And so she says to Brittany, hey, calm down, we can talk about this. But Brittany was not trying to talk to Jana. Brittany was trying to silence Jana, and she had lied about her wallet to lure Jana back to the store. this was a setup. Earlier that night, during their shift together, Jaina had caught Brittany stuffing a pair of yoga pants into her bag and had confronted her about it. And it's believed Brittany was worried Jaina was going to tell their boss about it the next day and that Brittany would be fired because of it. And then once again, her life would be derailed and she would be humiliated, and Brittany just couldn't have that. And so as Jaina slowly began to back up into the hallway with her hands up, trying to calm Brittany down, Brittany began to advance on her. And as soon as she did, Jaina screamed and turned and ran down that employee hallway. She turned right and bolted down the hallway towards the break room. She grabbed the break room door and she was trying to get it open, but before she could, Brittany had caught up to her and she smashed her over the head with the pipe. Immediately, Jaina turned around, she put her hands up over her head to protect herself, and she begged Brittany not to hit her again. But Brittany wasn't listening. Brittany just wound up and smashed her across the arms with the pipe. Jaina began screaming out and pleading with her to stop, but Brittany just kept on going. And for the next several minutes, Jaina just stood at the end of this hallway in front of the break room door, just trying desperately to protect herself with her hands. But Brittany was so strong and fast, and she kept striking her on her head and on the sides and anywhere else she could land a blow. The blood spatter on the walls of the end of that right hallway would later reveal that Jaina had gradually moved from a standing position down to the fetal position, meaning Brittany had literally beat her until she collapsed on the ground. And when Jaina hit the ground, she must have known she was trapped. There was no escape route for her, and she was so badly wounded that even if there was a way to go, Brittany was going to catch up to her and Brittany was going to stop her. And so Jaina just began quietly begging for her life. But Brittany had other plans for her. At the end of that right hallway that they were both in, Brittany had noticed a red toolbox was on the ground in the corner. And so around the time Jaina had fallen to the ground and was begging for her life, Brittany dropped the metal pipe and she casually opened the toolbox, revealing screwdrivers, nails, wrenches, hammers, all sorts of tools. And one by one, Brittany began reaching into this toolbox, taking out a tool, and then smashing, cutting, slashing, and beating Jaina with it. It would take Brittany roughly 10 minutes to cycle through every single tool in that toolbox. But shockingly, despite being dealt 330 significant wounds, Jaina was still alive and she was still pleading for her life. Frustrated, Brittany stood up, she chucked the tools on the ground, she turned around and she walked down the hallway all the way to the kitchen at the other end of that left hallway. She went inside and she grabbed a large knife. Then she marched back into the hallway. She went straight down all the way to Jaina. Jaina is still begging for her life, and Brittany just reaches down. She grabs her hair with her left hand and pulls her head forward towards her. Then she takes the knife with her right hand, she raises it up, and she brings it smashing down into the back of Jaina's skull. The knife would pierce her skull, it would pierce her brain, and that would be the killing blow. Once Jaina was deceased, Brittany simply got to work, staging the store to look like a robbery gone wrong. The first thing she did was drag Jaina's body out of the hallway and into the break room. And then once the door was shut, she headed out to the front of the store and just walked straight outside and climbed into Jaina's car that was still double parked outside. And she drove that around the block to a parking lot. And then when she got back inside of the shop, she went to that bin of shoes used for fitting pants. And she took out the size 14 men's shoe, she put them on her feet, and then she began walking around in the pool of blood underneath Jaina in the right hallway and began tracking the bloody prints all over the store to make it appear like a man was involved in the attack. And then after cleaning the shoes, she ransacked the store, and then she grabbed a knife and a screwdriver and she headed into the bathroom where she repeatedly stabbed and slashed herself before tying her hands and her feet with zip ties. At 8 a.m. the next morning, she was discovered. The seemingly small piece of information that Brittany kind of accidentally gave to police during that second meeting, this piece of information that kind of broke the case, that came when the police asked her if she knew what kind of car Jaina drove or if she'd ever been inside of Jaina's car, and Brittany would say, "No, I don't know what it looks like and I've never been inside of it." But a couple of days later, when Jaina's car would be found and the police would search it, they would find Brittany's hair and DNA all over it. So they knew Brittany had been lying to them. And so this is what ultimately led to Brittany's arrest, and she would later be convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more content. Your support means a lot to us and helps us create more videos that you'll love. We appreciate your feedback and would love to hear your thoughts on the video. What did you like about it? What could we improve? Your feedback will help us create better content in the future. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. We post new videos every week, so you'll always have something new to watch. Once again, thank you for watching and supporting our channel. We hope to see you again soon. Smiling face.